Chapter 2 of Part 6. There is no record of what followed, but I have no doubt that when Martha shut the door behind her, Jesus intimated somehow to Mary that she should go to the help of her sister, for he saw that Mary's peril was in the direction of quietism, as Martha's was in the direction of worry. I venture to refer the reader to two published sermons of mine entitled Mary, Our Religion and Beauty, and Martha, Our Religion and Service. From Bethany, Jesus went up to the metropolis. While passing, he saw there a man who had been blind from his birth. This was the first time that the disciples were in Jerusalem with Jesus. I can unite with Dean Milliman, who in a note to the text of his History of Christianity in Loco says, I hesitate at the arrangement of no passage in the whole narrative more than this history of the blind man. Muhammad also had a very famous incident about a blind man, but chapter 80 in the Quran does not indicate that he was the one who turned away. There's narrations that say that somebody in particular else was the one who turned away, but whether it was him or not is not as important as people tend to put, right? The lesson is the same. The harmonists have two opinions, one placing it at the time when Jesus escaped from the wrath of his enemies in the temple, and the other in the time I have given it in my text above. In favor of the former, it may be urged that the narrative seems so closely connected that we can hardly imagine an interval. Moreover, we know that the conflict in the temple was on the Sabbath, and that this healing took place on the Sabbath. 9:14. Was it chapter 9 of his history? The objection to that view is that Jesus evidently departed alone from the temple, while at the healing of the blind man, his disciples were with him. Archbishop Trench replies that it is easy to suppose that they could have extricated themselves as Jesus did himself, but the archbishop must have overlooked the fact that they were not present at that violent interview. The argument from the Sabbath is not conclusive, because the conflict took place on a festal Sabbath, and this healing on a regular weekly Sabbath. Both might have fallen on the same day, but it is not known that they did. I have been inclined to place it where it stands in the text, because the connection of the conclusion of the narrative seems to me quite as close as that which is urged for the beginning and the conclusion. John 10:22. So is that John 9:14 to John 10:22? Is that what they mean? Connects itself with the feast of dedication, at which his disciples were with him, as they were not on the former occasions. Moreover, a great difficulty lies against the other date, namely, that Jesus would scarcely have left the temple in a secret manner and then immediately perform a miracle which would attract all eyes to him at the moment of a popular tumult. Well, perhaps he wanted to have as much effect as possible if there was intention to it, but we know that Jesus wasn't all-knowing according to the Bible, so nor would there have been space during the remainder of the day for the events to have occurred, which are contained in the narrative. It is a beautiful thought that exhibits his godlike calmness to be able thus in his own peril to stand still and work the beneficent miracle. If I were writing a poem instead of a history, I should take the other date, in favor of which are lying Olshausen, Myers, Steeder, Trench, and Millman, against whom, and in favor of the view I adopt, stand Luke, Tholuck, DeWitt, Alfred, and Reverend Morris Dodds, who translated and edited Lang's Life of the Lord Jesus Christ, Mechanic places the healing on the day of the escape from the temple, the recognition of the subsequent proceedings during the visit at the dedication, the reader must examine and decide for himself. And one of the things, see, God-like, as in one is submissive to God and one is exhibiting qualities that remind people of God. If you put him back in his time. And so at Bethany, so Mary and Martha there, again, yeah, you gotta be his wives. That's basically what they're saying. Come unto me, all that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. I am the man, the truth. Oh, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Now see if he's the first of his people. And oh, is there a missing illustration here? Well, not a missing page, at least. Or is that just... No. But to explain some of this thing, see, you give your life in the cause. Everybody's supposed to give their life in the cause. And some people are meant to lead and some people are meant to follow, and that's okay. But certainly the person who leads has to be willing to give their life. Not these weak politicians that start all these wars and would never fight in them themselves. If you're not willing to step up there with the troops and do battle, then you're not worthy of, calling forth a war. Thank you very much. I mean, there's other factors that would keep away from the things, but everyone is the way. The Shayoshant, Masiach, Nabi, Avatar, any of them. But they manifested the truth and the revelation and the inspiration came through them. And through that revelation, you go to God. But God, of course, not literally being the Father, but, it's pretty easy to understand if you let go of the doctrinal things with it. As they were passing a certain place, they saw a man who had been blind from his birth. It occurred to the disciples to extract from their teacher some light on a dark difficulty as old as the history of human thought, traces of the profound study given by men to such questions as the existence of evil in the universe, of the good God, the transmission, if not of mental and moral traits, at least of penalties, the connection between sin and suffering, the kindred problems, are almost everywhere in the stream of recorded thought, as far up towards the fountainhead as the literature of the world enables us to ascend. It is probably impossible to say when man first began to have these conceptions in shapely manner in their minds, but this much is certain, that very early in the history of human society, we discover that the doctrine of retribution was not held merely loosely as hypothesis, but was embedded in the human mind and springing up in all forms of human literature and art. The heathen classics are full of it. The students of the old Greek dramaticists can never forget with what power it comes out in the writing of Aeschylus, the father of classic tragedy. How he shakes his readers with the grand horrors of the Prometheus, the Agamemnon, the Eumenides, how in them and his other tragedies which have survived we are thrilled by the perpetual reproduction of ancestral guilt, the punishment of successive generations of sinners who were pressed into the commission of atrocities by the doom which lay mountain heavy on the race. Well, things pile up. See, that's the thing. If you ignore all these little things, they pile up. And then you're like, oh, I'm particularly burdened. And it's like, well, don't let those problems of belief and action build up on themselves. Nor will they fail to remember how the greatest of Greek dramatic authors, in his wonderful Oedipus, seems to attempt an intimation of the intricacies of divine providence and the inevitability of the blow of retribution from the opening of the plot to the tremendous catastrophe, nor with what splendid diction and terrible beauty the same doctrines are set forth by Euripides in his wonderful Phaedra and overwhelming Medea. Indeed, the whole ancient classic tragedy surges with the heaving billows of sinful passion under the beating tempests of tremendous retribution. The ancient idea of penalty was personified. Nemesis, daughter of darkness and kinswoman of shame, was the agent of the entities in the punishment of the violation of law, and was the special avenger of family crimes, with the scent, the swiftness, and the certainty of a sleuth hound. She followed guilt through all the windings of society and all the doublings of blood until she smote it with the scourge that infuriated or the sword that destroyed. The skill of even Phidias was employed to embody in marble the popular conception of this personation of penalty. The same idea of the inevitable following of pain upon transgression at whatever intervals and through whatever prosperities, from which was always made the illogical conclusion that no suffering takes place without sin, lay dark and heavy on the Hebrew mind. In that simplest, grandest, and most solemn of all tragedies, the book Job, we see what's pronounced Ayub. We see a very powerful representation of this, a man serving God with such consecration and such constancy that even the Almighty spoke of him as his perfect servant, suddenly topples from the pinnacle of human prosperity to the dunghill of the lowest debasement, from surroundings of comfort which made him seem like a secure God, into privations and pains which ranked him among the most pitiful of the feeble. When his friends drew near to condole with him, they knew him not. They beheld a blackened ruin lie where they had stood a palace of delights. Now, how can he seem like a god if you're talking about one God? See, this person's use of God kind of shows how he ended up being Christian, right? When his friends drew near to condole with him, they knew him not. They beheld a blackened ruin lie where there had stood a palace of delights. The sight was so appalling that Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite lifted their voices and wept, and rent their mantles, and crowned themselves with dust, and sat down with the supper 7 days and 7 nights, and never a man of them essayed to break with syllables the awful silence of the transcendent grief. And when they did, when they had taken a week to contemplate the situation and study the case of Job, these 3 great men whom Job hath thought worthy to be his friends embodied their philosophy in such words as these. Eliphaz said, Whoever perished, being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off, even as I have seen, they that plough iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. Bildad said, Can the rush grow up without mire? Can the flag grow without water? Whilst it is yet in its greenness and not cut down, it withereth before any other herb. So are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrites' hope shall perish. Zophar boldly said, Know that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth. And amidst all this intimation or assertion of secret sin, Job was without fault. Yeah, it's not about the good things of life or the bad things of life that say who's ignorant or enlightened or evil or righteous. It's not, but it was impracticable for these men to conceive it possible that there could be so much suffering and no sin. We know that Job was in the midst of prodigious pains which are in no way a punishment for either of his own sins or the sins of any other. So when we come down to the days of Jesus and the passage of our text, we find the great teacher confronted with a case of special privation, and his disciples plumply put the direct question to him: who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Here is a sad case: a man who never beheld God's great expanse of the heavens, or a fruitful field of the earth, a man who never had seen the lovelight in the eye of mother or wife or child, a man whom the angel rays of holy light had never come flooding in from all the forms of nature and of art, full of reports of beauty. It was a dire privation. It never occurred to this disciple to ask the previous question: why came he thus? They never questioned their prejudices and their old ideas, which they had received from their fathers. If they had ever read the book of Job, they had forgotten its moral. They presumed sin. Here is suffering. Where is the sin? Suffering has only one parent, sin. All they seemed curious to know was, who was the sinner? It broke upon them like a new day on what they supposed the noon of their intelligence, when the master said, neither had this man sinned nor his parents. It was an utterance which smote the mouth of poetry with the hand of silence, and emptied the garnered treasure of philosophy into the sea. It is not at all necessary to suppose that the disciples believed in the doctrines of pre-existence and metempsychosis, or had even heard them. The doctrine of metempsychosis was widely received among the Jews of the Middle Ages, especially among the Kabbalists, who especially taught that blindness from birth was to be accounted for by this doctrine, but we cannot learn that it was taught in the times of Jesus. Yeah, that's the thing, is as much as people think Gilgal, see reincarnation, there's 10 verses that mention reincarnation in the Bible. We can't actually make the point that they believed in reincarnation or transmigration of the souls or whatever. Lightfoot quotes the Rebbins as teaching that the embryo might sin in the womb, and as quoting for proof the struggle between Jacob and Esau, Genesis 25:22. The Luck believes that this was merely the private opinion of particular individuals. Now, I'll throw in the Islamic view, nobody sins before puberty. There's no moral sin that accuse on anybody for puberty with sanity, And there's talk in the last days, people will hit puberty, but their minds will not be ready yet, because of the drugs and all that sort of stuff that makes people hit puberty at 9 years old, or 7 or 6 or 5 or 12 or whatever, when it used to be standard that they didn't even know for a 13-year-old female or a 15-year-old male that they had hit puberty yet just because of their age, that used to be standard, sometimes it was that year, sometimes it was a year or two to follow, there were people who were like starving to death and hit it when they were 12 or 11 or something, but that wasn't the common thing. There was no sufficient proof that these Platonic ideas had sprung generally among the Hebrew people, or that they prevailed to any extent, even in the schools of the rabbis. Here is the ray of light which Jesus let in on one case, and which may be applicable to millions. Neither have this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Not that the man had committed sin of any kind, not that his parents were faultless, not that he never committed any sin, or his parents were faultless, but that the blindness was neither punitive nor the result of sin. Now, the Bible mentions stuff upon the third and fourth generation. It's like, well, there's lingering influences in society after you die, so that's what that's talking about. That's pretty clear. Not that, anybody bears the sin burden of another, just what it was, the grand revelation to the world that suffering may exist without sin, and as part of the working of a beneficent law whose sweep describes a circumference too large for human vision, but enclosing a vast field of God's benign operations. Of this circle, the segment, if visible to us, is too small to find a point for us to find the center, measure the radius, and calculate the area with all the aids of the geometry known to man. Jesus says that a man may suffer for God's sake, and by the cure of the blind man and the results of that cure he demonstrated this blessed fact. Jesus added the saying, "While it is day, we must work the works of him who sent us. Night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." The proverbial expression, "night comes when no man can work," simply meant that he who did not his work in the day cannot do it in the night. That when a man neglects an opportunity to do what he should do, he cannot recover it. And Jesus applies this general principle to himself and his disciples, as he was the light of the world. Lucifer means light bringer. Lux Epheros. What fitter thing than that he should open the eyes of the blind? So he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and anointed the blind man's eyes therewith, and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam." Anciently, a virtue was supposed to be in saliva for disorders of the eyes. As we have learned